Hi everyone, this is Sean Ismail from the Cloud Ranger, and you are viewing the Microsoft Azure training. So today is going to be the part 4 of Azure Virtual Networks, and we are going to talk about VIP, DIP, and PIP, or the VIP, DIP, and PIP. These are the different IP addresses that are available to you from Azure, Microsoft Azure, for different reasons that we'll get into in details. Some of this you have already looked at, but we have not yet gone into too much details of this, but we'll be doing that right now in this session. Okay, so the first one is the VIP, or the virtual IP address. So traditionally, the addressing that we are familiar with on-premise is something like this. If you have a public domain name, for example, cloudranger.net, that's my domain name, that would have a public DNS entry for a public IP address. So for example, something like this, 61.195.124.95, that would be the public IP address. So cloudranger.net would could translate or could resolve to this public IP address. And this public address would be somewhere assigned to the outside interface of your firewall, and your firewall is going to do some sort of a netting, network address translation, and forward it to your web server. For example, in my example here is web app 100, which has also a private IP address. This private IP address is assigned to your virtual machine or your server, and that is your public IP address. So moving on, the way this works in Azure, and this is what we have been doing so far, is that every time we create a virtual machine, if you remember from the previous sessions, we mentioned that it creates a cloud service, or it should be contained in a cloud service. And this cloud service could have multiple virtual machines in there, not just one-to-one, but it should be a one-to-many relationship here. So what happens is every cloud service that is created does have a public IP address. So something like 61.195.124.95 would be assigned to this cloud service. And when the user will go to, for example, I went to cloudranger.net, Microsoft Azure will provide the cloud services DNS, which would be something like this. Web App Service 100, just because that was the cloud service name, .cloudapp.net. So anytime you see that address, you will know that this address will actually be resolving to a public address that is assigned to a cloud service. So how people access this is that they go to this public DNS and it takes you to the cloud service. The cloud service will know the endpoints on this virtual machine and let you through based on the port numbers. So there will be a PAT, or port address translation, for from the cloud service to the virtual machine. So that's how the addressing has been taking place so far in all our sessions. Whenever we created a virtual machine and we tried to connect through it to with RDP, so we'll RDP to this address with a specific port number, which will hit the cloud service and take you to the virtual machine. So that's basically the VIP, or VIP would be the IP address, the public IP address that's assigned to the cloud. The thing to remember here for both exam and for your production work is that your VIP is not assigned to a virtual machine. The VIP, or the virtual IP, the public IP address, is always assigned to the cloud service. So let's talk about VIP a little bit. So VIP is a public IP address. VIP is created when the cloud service is created and resources are allocated to it. So every time you create a cloud service, it's not going to create a VIP for you. What it will do is create a VIP for you when you assign resources or allocate resources to it. It means you create a cloud service, then you connect a VM in it, and that's when this cloud service will end up getting a public IP address. This is something that's provided by Microsoft, this public IP addresses. And it's randomly picked based on the region you're creating the cloud service at. So if you create a cloud service in West USA, you'll have a different range of IP addresses that Azure will provide to you. If you create one in East, that will be a different IP address range. And we'll go through that as well. The VMs in the cloud service can be configured to be accessed by the VIPs and assigned port numbers. So for example, when we are RDPing to the virtual machine, we are RDPing to the cloudapp.net, service name.cloudapp.net, that is your public IP address of the VIP, and it's followed by a port number to specifically go to a certain machine. So if you have 5 virtual machines in one cloud service, you'll still use the same DNS, your service name.cloudapp.net, but you'll change the port number, so there will be a port translation that will take you to the specific virtual machines. So this is what will happen. In this scenario, in this diagram, you can see there's only one cloud service, but with 2 virtual machines. So still, the user will be connecting to web app service 100.cloudapp.net. However, it will have a different port assigned to each of these virtual machines. And based on that port here, the cloud service will know which virtual machine to send you to. Obviously, you can have one-to-one relationship. So instead of having one cloud service containing those both virtual machines, you can have a cloud service and a virtual machine, a cloud service and a virtual machine, and you'd basically have different addresses to connect at that time. So let's talk about the default behavior of a VIP. A VIP is lost when a VM is stopped or deallocated. So we know when a VIP is created. That's when the cloud service is created. However, this VIP will be lost if the virtual machine has been shut down from the Azure portal. The other time this VIP is lost is also when the cloud service is deleted. So if you go and delete a cloud service, since the VIP is associated to cloud service, it will just delete it. This is exactly what that makes VIP address very unpredictable. So what does that mean? It means that if you have a public IP address assigned to a cloud, and for some reason, if it's a lab or if it is just an environment that you do not care about and you just want to get rid of it, what it will do is you will lose that IP address that was assigned to you by Azure for the VIP. And this may have firewall implications. For example, if you have a virtual machine that connects to another organization, automated connection or whatever, to upload a file or anything else, maybe that organization only allows a certain IP, public IP, to connect, and they have firewall rules to actually only allow certain IP addresses to connect to their systems as a security precaution. So if you have a lab or if you have a system that only has a VIP but only turns on it at a specific time, or it's a lab environment so you don't care and you create the virtual machine as many times and you want to connect to that other organization, they will only remember the first time you give them the VIP. They will not be going in and changing their firewall rules with the public IP address you keep giving them. So there are implications of having a VIP address which is not set static to the cloud service. So the other thing that will be affecting with a regular VIP is that the DNS. So Microsoft gives you your service name.cloudapp.net, a DNS name, public DNS name for you when it creates the VIP. So you can use that DNS, cloudapp.net DNS, to connect to your services and do whatever. However, for many organizations, that's not going to work. They will want their own DNS to connect or to go to their services. For example, their website. You want your domain.net or domain.com rather than Microsoft service name.cloudapp.net. So ideally, what you do is have an A record in your DNS to point to that IP address. However, you cannot do an A record in this case because since your IP address changes every time you stop or shut down or recreate the virtual machine, what you'll have to do is not create an A record, but a CNAME to your service.cloudapp.net to make sure that that stays consistent rather than putting an A record that keeps changing. So what is the solution of all these problems of this default behavior? Reserved VIP. So you reserve the public IP address that's assigned to a cloud. So rather than Microsoft assigning random ones, you make sure that Microsoft still assigns them, but it assigns the same VIP every time you create or you turn on that virtual machine which is associated with VIP. So what we are going to do is talk about reserved IP right now. The way you do that is that a reserved VIP or reserved IP will be associated to a cloud service. So you put a static address to the cloud service, and it removes all the limitations of the VIP. But however, it has its own limitations as well. The first issue that it has is that the existing VIP cannot be converted to a reserved VIP. So if you have had already a virtual machine that's up and running and there's a VIP associated with it, you will not be able to make that IP address static. And the next one is that the VMs must be created with the VIPs reserved first. So once again, if you already have a VIP and it already has everything set up, you cannot go and just create, just assign the VIP to a new VIP or a static VIP to the virtual machine. The only way you can create a static VIP is actually create it and assign it while you create the virtual machine. So if you already have a virtual machine, you cannot assign a static VIP to it. And this may make sense. You cannot allocate more than one reserved VIP to a cloud service. So you cannot have like 5 different IP addresses that are all pointing to cloud services. For most people, this will not be an issue, but I've heard that there are times when one single service is required to have multiple IP addresses for whatever reasons. And of course, you cannot do this from the management portal. You have to use the PowerShell to do this. So when you create the virtual machine, it has to be created through PowerShell. And this is what brings me to a tricky place right now, because we have not really gone into a session where we talk about creating virtual machines. So far, all the virtual machines that we have created were just created to demonstrate other concepts. But in this session, we will talk about creating virtual machines with PowerShell. I do not want you to get completely boggled by, the details of how the virtual machine is going to be created. I'm just going to show the specific parts of a script which actually reflects setting a static VIP. So when in the future sessions you learn about completely creating virtual machines with scripts and commandlets and stuff like that, you may be able to revisit the script and look at it. I will have this script actually for you to download on the blog website, and on the YouTube description I will have a link directly to go to that script. The next limitation of reserved VIP is that every subscription can have up to 20 reserved VIPs. It might work for most people. Once again, different organizations have different requirements, so they might require one subscription to have more than 20. All you have to do is call up Azure support. It's free to get more than 20. You can just ask them. They'll probably just ask for an explanation why you need more IP addresses, and that will be it. So these are the two commandlets that we will be using to connect to the reserved VIP or to create the reserved VIP. So I'm not going to spend so much time on this slide right now. I'm going to go to the demonstration and show you a couple of things, and we'll come back to the slides. Okay? Okay, so we are on my client computer, which is already connecting to my subscription. And I actually do have a virtual machine already created here to save some time. This is just a basic virtual machine. There's no VNets or anything created. I created this through a quick create, so which is by basically going to new, compute virtual machines and do a quick create and put in all the information here. So that's how this virtual machine was created. So let's go, and this is up and running right now. So let's go ahead and click on this virtual machine, C-Ranger VM100. I want to scroll down over here and show you the VIP or the virtual IP address. And this is the IP address that Azure assigned to the cloud service. It's called the public virtual IP or VIP address. And you can see this is the public address. This internal IP address, it does not look like the private IP ranges, the standard IP ranges like 192.168 or 172 or 10 dot whatever, but this is one given by Azure as well for the internal IP address of the VM. You have to understand, like I mentioned, that this public IP address VIP is not assigned to the virtual machine, even though we are coming into the virtual machine and looking at this address. This is actually assigned to the cloud service that was created while this virtual machine was created. So as we know that the VIP is actually the cloud services IP address. And if you go to the cloud services details over here, you can actually see that it does not directly give you the IP address for it. I mean, it does give you the IP address for it over here, but it also shows you the endpoints this cloud services allows on the virtual machine, which is this one. So this is one. These are the couple of spots you can actually go and see the VIP or the virtual IP address. So there's a nice little document that you can find online where you can actually go and look at all the ranges of all public IP addresses that are there for different location or region. So for example, my location is East US 2, and you can go to this URL over here. So you can pause the video and copy this up for yourself. So what this will do if you go to this link is that it will give you a like an XML document which you can download and look at all the IP ranges. So I have already done that. I have downloaded the XML file here. So if you go and look at this, open up this file in Notepad, you'll see that it gives the region name or the location name and all the ranges of public IP addresses and their subnet that are available on this IP range, on this region. So for example, if we go to our virtual machine, we are in East US 2. So if you look at the East US 2 region, you will see that this is where the IP address is taken from. So for example, this is 137.116. So let's go to East US 2. We are looking for the range 137.116. So it's 137.116. You can see these are the two ones, 82. So it probably took from one of the ranges over here. Based on the subnetting, you should be able to find out which one it went to, 137.116, 82.36. So you can obviously go to your region, wherever you are located, and you can find out where the range you took that from. So this is a neat little document to have handy, and Microsoft obviously keeps changing that as they add more stuff or remove stuff from there. So this is where you can check VIP. And what I'm going to introduce you to today is also look at information of the Azure VM directly from PowerShell. So the way you do that is pass this command, get Azure VM. So in your subscription, if you do get Azure VM and you press enter, it will actually show you the virtual machine that is running. So this is the service name, the cloud service name, and this is the name of the virtual machine, which is name. It says that's ready to roll. So the way you get information for this specific virtual machine is to actually write the switch over here, CRanger VM 100, that's my service name, and then the name is CRanger VM 100, or whatever virtual machine name you put in there. And if you just do this much and press enter, it will give you all the details of the virtual machine. You can see the details like the name of the virtual machine, the IP address. This is the local IP address that's assigned to your virtual machine. However, you look over here, the public IP addresses is empty. And this actually should make sense because there's no public IP address directly attached to this VM. It gets its public IP address from the cloud service. So you cannot look at the VIP information by just passing this commandlet. You have to add something else to it. So what we are going to do is we're going to take this command and type it to get Azure endpoint. You remember the endpoints? The way we get the endpoints is come to the VM and go to the endpoints here. And we should see that by default, 2 endpoints are created here. So what we do over here is get Azure endpoint and press enter. So here we can see that these are the 2 endpoints we had, 5986, so 5986 here, and over here we have 62908, which is actually taking to the local port 3389. This is the one we use for remote desktop. This is the one we used for PowerShell. However, looking at this information, you can actually see the VIP, which is obviously same for these 2 ports because they're the same virtual machine coming through the same cloud service. So this is one way to also locate the VIP. I usually just go over here depending on what I'm trying to do and just click on this and look at the VIP that's assigned to me. So technically it should be the same. So, and these all information are going to be the same. These are various ways actually to locate the VIP. So let's go ahead, and we know now that this VIP address is a temporary one. And let's actually start to look if we can actually do a demonstration of that. So we know that this is our VIP, 137.116.36. So I'm going to show the limitation of a VIP. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off this virtual machine from here, means shut it down and deallocate it. And based on our limitations of VIP, the next time I turn on this virtual machine, it will not have the same VIP, and the VIP would actually change. Your DNS name, which is crangervm100.cloudapp.net, which is actually your cloud service address, will still remain the same. It's just that the DNS entry to the IP address will change. So let's go ahead and shut down this virtual machine. And when you do that, it actually tells you that if you continue, the IP addresses that were assigned to this virtual machine will be released. So this is for both the VIP and the internal IP address as well. So Azure basically just goes and releases all those IP addresses to their IP pool. So we'll click yes on this one. And I'm going to pause the video till this virtual machine completely stops. Okay, so the VM completely stopped. Now you can look at the status. It's stopped and deallocated. Means all the IP addresses have been deallocated. So we're going to go ahead and turn on this virtual machine once again. If you come inside, you look that all this information is no longer there because Azure went ahead and completely deallocated this virtual machine. Everything else is in there though. So let's go ahead and start the virtual machine. Okay, so the virtual machine has started. And by the way, I do pause these videos for all these activities to take place in the background. A virtual machine could sometimes take even, I've seen 10 minutes to start. So if you're following along, you might have to wait for the virtual machine to really start and get into a running state. So anyways, so what we were trying to prove here is that the last time this was running, the VIP was 137.116.82.36. Let's look at this. And this is going to prove the concept of the limitations is that if you say it's 137.168.81.255, so obviously the VIP address has changed from what it was previously right after the virtual machine was restarted, after it was stopped in a deallocated mode. So that's one thing I wanted to demonstrate. And obviously, when you go to cranger100.cloudapp.net, so if we come over here, for example, and do something like this, ping crangervm100.cloudapp.net, you can see that it's not going to be able to ping, but it will resolve to that IP address over here. So Microsoft does this DNS, public DNS bit for you already when you create the cloud service and put a virtual machine in there. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about reserving a VIP, a virtual IP. The way we do this is, let's clear the screen. First, you have to reserve, or you have to create the reserved VIP. You cannot just assign VIP to a already created virtual machine. So we will not be able to assign a VIP to the virtual machine that's already running. We'll have to create a new virtual machine with the VIP that we will create over here now. And the commandlet that you will do, so let's actually see if we actually have any reserved VIP right now. Or you know what, maybe I'll just create one first and then we'll check that. So the way you create this, the commandlet is new Azure reserved IP. You have to give a name like everything else to in Azure. So there will have to be a reserved name. I don't know. I'll just call it my reserved IP. And okay. And then it has to have a label. So we'll put a label in there. So we'll do a reserved label. It's just another identifier for this IP address. The location, you have to always like provide a location so Microsoft Azure knows where to go and pull that public IP address from. Like I mentioned when I was opening that file, that all the locations have separate ranges. So my range over here will be US East 2. That's the command that you have to put in there for reserving an IP address. And I need to mention this right now that you do not provide the public IP address. All you do is provide the location. Microsoft goes and picks one public IP address based on the location and the ranges it has in the location. So let's hit enter on that one. It took about 10 seconds for this to get it. So we have a reserved IP right now. It's not doing anything, but it just went and reserved that IP. So the way to actually look at which IP address was reserved is to run the commandlet get Azure, if I can type, get Azure reserved IP. It's very simple to remember. If you click enter on that, you can see that this was the reserved IP name, my reserved IP name, and that's the address. That's what Azure went and picked up based on the region that you had, or the location you had provided. Is it in use? False. Means this is just an IP that was reserved, but right now it's not assigned to anything. And that's all there is to reserve an IP address. So what you do at this point is take this IP address and create a virtual machine through PowerShell, and you would actually point to the my reserved IP to do that. So I'm not going to use this reserved IP. We're just going to leave it alone. I actually do have a script. It's quite a long script. So what this does is that it will go and it will create a new reserved IP address, and it will also create the virtual machine with that reserved IP address. So we'll be not using the one we have created already. It's going to be a new one. So I'm not going to go through all the details of how this virtual machine is created because you really don't need to at this point. Just a couple of things. The variables are right here. You need to make sure that for your environment you change them, like whatever the virtual machine name you want and things like that. I'm creating a store where the virtual machine will be stored. This is my cloud service name. So essentially this will become web app service 100.cloudapp.net. My virtual machine's name is just web app 100. Credentials and everything over here. So just like my previous commandlet over here, my reserved IP name over here was my reserved IP. So I'm not going to call this my reserved IP. I'll just call this my new reserved IP. Just keep it consistent here. And what it will do is that it will take this and it is going to put that in this command over here. Look at this, new Azure reserved IP, and you can see that this command list will look familiar right now with this one over here, except that we are using variables to pass that along. So that's all this script is doing. It's creating a reserved IP first for you as well. And here, if you look at the new Azure VM, so this is how you actually create a virtual machine in PowerShell. Don't worry about what we are doing with this commandlet here. All I want to say is that when you are going to use a reserved IP, you're going to just provide a switch dash reserved IP name with the reserved IP name variable over here, which is the one that we had created earlier at this location. And that's all there is to it. So I'm going to run this script, and it takes some time because obviously it's going to run the script to create the virtual machine, and it will do all of that. So it will take some time to do that. So let's go ahead and run that. And I'm going to just, I think it's going to, I think I messed up over here. I just went and ran that single line command rather than the whole script. So just be right back. Anyway, so I went offline and just cleared all the messes I have created with running that script that way. So the way you'd run the entire script would be this button over here, run a script, rather than the run selection. So let's go ahead and run the script. It's quite a verbose script, so it actually tells you what it is doing and when it's done. So I'm going to run this entire script and let everything be created for us and come back when everything is created. Okay, that took about, I don't know, about 11 minutes for the entire script to run, and it created a new virtual machine, web app 100. So if you can go over here, we can see that it created this new virtual machine, and it used the static IP address to actually create the virtual machine. So let's go ahead and run the command get Azure reserved IP. And we should see at this point that there are two. One was the my reserved IP, which we created earlier. But look, now it has the my new reserved IP. It has a new IP address, obviously, and looks like it's assigned to a service name, web app service, and a deployment, which is the VM, and it's in use. It's true. So it's actually created the whole thing here. And it is 153.171. So what we can do is we can go over here and we can check that that's the IP address. So how do we know that this is going to be static? Well, the first thing, we can run this commandlet and we can see that it is going to be associated with this web service, and it's a static IP address because it's reserved. So let's go back over here and we are going to prove this, that it's static. So if you remember the limitation that if we turn off this virtual machine, it is supposed to lose that IP address. So we're going to come back after stopping this and restarting this virtual machine. So I'm going to go offline and stop this and again go start this, and we'll come back and see that it still has the reserved IP address. Okay, the VM has stopped, and now let's go ahead and start it again. Okay, the virtual machine is running right now. So let's go ahead and get into the virtual machine here. And what I want to show is the VIP. So here, the VIP is 23.101.153.171. And you can see over here, 23.101.153.171. So even if the virtual machine was deallocated and it stayed there and we turned it back on, just because it was associated with a reserved IP, it went and got that IP address and not a new one. This immediately kind of gets rid of all the limitations a VIP actually has. So the last thing we want to do over here is how to remove a VIP. So we will try to remove the one we had created earlier, and the commandlet for that is remove Azure reserved IP. And I press tab usually to do the auto completion. So what you need over here is the reserved IP name. So we take this, and that's all we put over there. And technically, that's all we should have to do. It confirms. Let it delete. All right, it does take like about a few seconds for that to happen. So let's do get Azure, typing somewhere else, get Azure reserved IP, and we should just see one entry in there, which is the my new reserved IP. So we went ahead and removed this one. Okay, so let's go back to our slides. That's all I had for demo for now. So going to our slides, these are the two commandlets we were using so far. New Azure reserved IP, and we put a reserved name and a label at the location, and that's what will reserve the IP for you. And while creating the VM, just remember and reiterate once again that you only can have a VM associate itself with a reserved VIP is when it's being created. So when you're creating the new virtual machine, you have to make sure that you have the reserved IP name switch with the reserved IP name for this to happen. Okay, so that's there as far as the VIP is concerned, or the virtual public IP address. And next, we are going to move into DIP, or the internal IP address. And this is a little bit easier from the VIP because DIP is the IP address which we all are aware of. It's nothing but the internal IP address your virtual machine gets. So this one is not that bad of a deal because we have looked into this many times before on premise. So let's get started. This is the same diagram we had earlier when we were talking about VIP, but with DIP, we are talking about this part of this diagram, where the private address that's associated with the virtual machine. So let's talk about DIP a little bit more in details. So we know that DIP is a private IP address for a virtual machine. So anytime you turn on a virtual machine, it gets a private IP address. It is sort of automatically provided by Azure. So anytime you spin a virtual machine with a quick create or whatsoever, you'll see that the virtual machine already has an internal IP address. So the contrast between this and an on-premise would be that on-premise, if you spin up a virtual machine, there would be a DHCP, any virtual machine or any server. Let's talk about any server. It would turn itself on and it will go and look for a DHCP server and get an IP address from a scope in your DHCP server. In VMM or VMware, um, now you have that option where you don't have to have a DHCP server, but your virtual machine manager will provide you an IP address from an IP pool. And that's what exactly is happening in Azure, except the fact that you do not have any control over it. So Microsoft will give you a random IP address it thinks it's free and give it to your virtual machine as an internal IP address. And you do not have to do any specific configuration for this. You can do a quick create VM and you'll get that. Now, the next thing is um, if you actually have a virtual network and you are creating a virtual machine and you are specifying the virtual network, Azure will go and get an IP address from the VNet range. So it's not going to give you a random internal IP address. Since you have mentioned that you want to use this VNet, it will actually assign an IP address from that VNet. And we'll go through that in our demonstration to show that. The next thing is, just like VIP, DIP can also set static. Like this is no different from our on-premise physical server, where you can not configure anything and it will get from your DHCP server or from the IP pool, full pool from the VMM. Or you can assign a static IP address, an internal, like 192.168.1.100, for example. You can put a static IP address, and the same is possible with DIP as well. Okay, so let's go in our client computer a little bit and go through a little bit of a demonstration of what I'm actually talking about. So back to our client computer, as you can see, I already have two virtual machines made over here, CRanger VM100 and CRanger VM200. The difference between these two is that this one, CRanger VM100, was created as a quick create of a virtual machine. So I did not specify anything except the name, the username, password, and the location, which is East US 2. And CRanger VM200, I actually created this with a virtual network specified. So let's look at the virtual network here. You can see it's called RangerNet. And if I go into details and I go to configure, you can actually see the subnet over here that's created 192.168.1.0. So the difference between these two is if we go to CRanger VM100, we can see that there's an internal IP address. This is the DIP, which is provided by Azure. It's a random IP address, 10.238.108.104. It's internal to the virtual machine. So if you do an IP config, this is the address you are going to see. However, in CRanger VM200, this one was the one where we have specified the VNet. So having provided the VNet information while creating this, you can see that the IP address is a little different. It's 192.168.1.4. So what happened is Azure figured out that since I specified the VNet, it's going to take the IP range from the VNet's IP range. So that's the two difference between these two virtual machines. One is provided by Azure, one is provided internally. In a production environment, depending on how your requirements are, most of the time you will probably create a virtual machine and specify a virtual network to it. It keeps things more organized. It keeps the subnet consistent, so you understand by looking at the subnet or the IP address which virtual network your your virtual machine belongs to. So chances are this is the option you will take most likely. And we have done this many times. So we go to from gallery, and what we did was, just to show you once again, is that you'd create a random virtual machine. I'm just putting a name over here. I'm not going to really create it. So this is the information you definitely need to put properly. And what you do over here is this is where in the region affinity over here, virtual network, this is how you specify that you need the virtual machine to go out with the VNet. And you have done many times this already in this series for virtual networks. So I'm assuming that you already know how to do this quite properly. So those are the two things I wanted to demonstrate over here for now. The other thing I want to show you over here is that we will connect to one of these virtual machines here, and I'm going to show how you see from the virtual machine the IP address and how it's consistent. Okay, so we have RTP'd into the server. So as soon as you can see over here, the BG info, it shows the internal IP address 192.168.1.4. So that is your DIP. So that is the information that we had over here. 192.168.1.4 here. So you can see that in the internal IP address over here. And the public IP address, you can see 23.101.148.25. That's actually the VIP. So if you go and open up a console here and do ipconfig, you will see that 192.168.1.4 shows up over here. That's also your internal IP address. So far so good. Now the limitation of this. Similar to VIP, if you have a virtual machine and it has an internal IP address, if you shut this down from the portal and you go and restart it, the internal IP address will change. So this is like DHCP. It can go and pick up any IP address that's available to you from your VNet or which Azure provides to you. So you have to remember that because there are times when you want your virtual machine to always have a static IP address and not totally depend on a DHCP. In fact, when we were doing on-premises stuff, I've rarely seen a server even have a DHCP address. It's always a static IP address. Now, this is a little tricky. When Microsoft initially came up with Azure, they did not have a way to put internal IP address to be static for your virtual machines. What they instead did was they said that as long as you do not shut down and completely shut down and deallocate your virtual machine, it will have an infinite lease from your DHCP as your DHCP. So what will that do? If you go and shut down the virtual machine from here, rather than shutting this down completely and deallocating from here, as long as the virtual machine was shut down and restarted that way, you would always have the same IP address given back to you. So it almost simulates a static IP address because you're getting an infinite lease and you're getting that. But you have to remember that Azure is an usage-based billing service. So what happens is that if you just go and turn off your virtual machine from here, you are still going to have all the resources associated with that connected to that virtual machine, and you will still be charged. The only way you can actually have a virtual machine sit over here and not be charged for it is go to shut down and make sure that you stop and deallocate this virtual machine. However, you lose all your IP addresses, not only your VIP, but also your DIP, which is your internal IP. And it actually mentions this over here. So what did that do? Well, infinite lease was fine, but I do not want to get charged for this when I'm at home at night, and this is my lab environment. So most likely I would go and shut it down from here. But when I turn them back on, I'll lose the IP address. So what happens if this is a domain controller? What happens if this is like a bunch of virtual machines where there were applications being run on that were dependent on IP addresses? You'll totally get messed up. So what you'd have to do is that shutdown from here. So there is not much compute bill, but still for the IP addresses, for everything else, you'll be billed for, and there will still be certain charges. So this did not fly very well. And it also created a couple of confusions. So the best practice, for example, a domain controller or DNS server is making sure the server has a static IP address. And a lot of people had a little bit confusion. They were like, well, infinite lease, but it's a lease. What happens to my domain controller? So this is actually a little funny because we would go to Azure's documentation on MSDN and they would clearly mention that, hey, we know that the best practice is to have a static IP address, but don't worry about it. Just put your regular, just do what you're doing in Azure, and as long as you have infinite lease, you'll be fine. So when Microsoft changed that and added the capability of putting a static IP address on this virtual machine, what they ended up doing is they went and updated the document and said, oh, no, don't worry about it. You should always follow the best practices and make sure your domain controller gets a static IP address. So that's going to be the next part of this where I show you how to add a static IP address to your already created virtual machine. Unlike VIP, where you have to create a virtual machine with a static VIP, uh, on a DIP or internal IP address, you can assign a static IP address while the virtual machine has already been created. So since we already created this virtual machine, we will not recreate that. Now, you might say that, hey, Sean, you know what? That's almost natural. I already have a virtual machine. All I'm going to do is come over here, go to Open Network Settings, go to my adapter, change adapter settings, right click on this, properties, and this is what we naturally do. I'm going to come over here, use the following IP address, and I'll create the static IP address over here. No, that's not how you set a static IP address to a virtual machine in Azure. In Azure, what you'll have to do is assign a static IP address, just like VIP, and then create the relationship between your virtual machine and that static IP address outside of this virtual machine. So at no point in Azure, and remember this carefully, at no point in Azure ever you'll have to come over here and use this option to put IP addresses. Doesn't matter it's DHCP or not, or static or not. You do not do this over here. So you will be doing that in, like you might have guessed, in PowerShell. That's the only way to do that. And the way you do that, I do have the commandlets, but I do have to show you something first, which is let's get information on my virtual machines. So get Azure VM. Now I have two virtual machines, so I have to show you the one that we are kind of using right now. So we know that that's going to be the service name first. So CRanger VM 200, that's the one I want to show you. And then the name of the VM, which is just name, and it's the same for my case. So as you know that your service name and your VM name can be separate, so that's why it requires you to mention both, but in our case it's the same. Let's press enter. So we will see our internal IP address here, 192.168.1.4. This is how you'll see that. So how do you, in on-premise these days, you guys assign a static IP address? You know what? The first thing I do is I'll just go do a ping 192.168.1 dot whatever. And you know what? You can still do that from here. Let's go to the virtual machine, 192, ping 192.168.1.100. I want to see if this IP is being used or not. And that's fine. You know what? It cannot reach there because because I've not assigned it to anything else. So that's one quick dirty way of finding out if you have that IP address set as static or not. Azure takes it to the next level. So it actually has a command to check if you have a static IP address assigned to a virtual machine or not. So the way you do that is test Azure static VNet IP. VNet IP here means the internal IP. And then you put the VNet name. And I think our name was CRangerNet. That's the name of your VNet. And you check for the IP address. So you put IP address and you do 192.168.1.100. Let me check if this IP address has been given to anywhere else or not. And I just found out that's not my VNet name. I think it's RangerNet. Let's try that again. So now Azure is going and seeing through our VNet that if this was assigned to anybody else or not. As you can see, it says is available, true, means this has not been assigned to anybody else. So we know now that we can assign this address to somebody else. So how do you do that? Well, like before, let's go get the virtual machine. So we know get Azure VM service name, we'll get the virtual machine here, put a pipe to that, and do set Azure static VNet IP and put the IP address here. So the IP address will be 192.168.1.100. That's the one we want. And we are also going to pipe this to the update Azure VM over here as well. So what this will do is it finds the virtual machine, which is in our case is 200, and we know the 200's internal IP address was 192.168.1.4. So we are changing that to a static VNet right now, a static IP address with 192.168.1.100. Let's go ahead and press enter on this. And as you know, this will take a little bit of time because the update Azure VM actually restarts the virtual machine. So yes, it will restart the virtual machine while the static IP is being set. Okay, so let's hit enter on that. Okay, and that succeeded. So update Azure VM, and you can see it has succeeded. Obviously, my RDP session has crashed here because it was restarting that. So I've closed that. Let's go ahead and RDP to it again, and you can see that it's still starting and it has not completed, even though the command has completed and it went and did the update VM. Okay, so we are logging into the virtual machine. And we can see the internal IP has been changed to 192.168.1.100. So if we go over here and do an IP config, we can see it's changed to 192.168.1.100. And similarly, if we come over here and go click on this one, we'll see that this is 192.168.1.100. So if we come over here and run this command, the PowerShell command to get the information on this, we'll see that it's 192.168.1.100. Okay, now this is the thing you might look at, and this is what I was curious about, that what happens, we know that we created this as a static IP address just because we did this PowerShell command thing here, but where is this as a static IP address? If you come over here and you click on this properties, you'll find out that there is nothing set over here. So you cannot go to a virtual machine and look at the virtual machine and see if it's a static IP address or not. Because the way Azure works is a lot of configuration is provided to a virtual machine when it starts up. So just because we have provided this command over here, we have ran this command over here, Azure knows that any time this virtual machine is turned on, it needs to apply a static IP address externally to the virtual machine, and that's how it has got that. So that's the way you put, or that's the way you add a DIP or an internal IP address to a virtual machine in Azure. And the way you remove this IP address, a static IP address, and make it go to DHCP is same as adding the virtual, the static IP address to the virtual machine, but the command this time is going to be remove Azure static VNet IP. That's it, and you do update Azure VM. That will remove the static IP address from this virtual machine, and when it restarts using the update Azure VM, it will actually go to a DHCP mode, and it will pick up the IP address randomly from the virtual network, and Azure will do that for you. So as you can see, there was no DHCP involved in this, and Azure does that DHCP portion for you. We do not have any DHCP server. We did not even configure it anywhere, so it's a pretty nice thing to have. So back to our slides, what we have done here is like we checked first if an internal IP address or DIP was available to the test Azure static VNet IP commandlet. Then we got a virtual machine and added a static IP address with set Azure static VNet IP address. And we went and removed that with the removed Azure static VNet IP. So just like VIP, DIP also has limitations. And that limitation is taken care of with this static IP addressing. It's a very important part of the exam as well as for production. It's important that we do things as close to on premises for the various Microsoft product best practices. Okay, so that concludes our DIP. And the last one, so we did DIP, VIP, and DIP. Now we are going to go and do PIP, which is the instance level public IP address. So PIP, instance level public IP address. I have no idea how Microsoft came up with this VIP, DIP, and PIP because as you can see, PIP is instance level public IP address. So I don't know, PIP for whatever reason. So looking at our diagram here, you can see that so far we have talked about the public IP address called VIP, which is associated with the cloud service, and we talked about DIP, which is the internal IP address. So what exactly is PIP, and why do we even need it? So this is actually an IP address, a public IP address that can be assigned to a virtual machine. So far we have been accessing a virtual machine with the cloud's IP address. But now, for whatever reason, and let's get into the reasons a little bit later, you might need a public IP address associated directly to a virtual machine. You have to remember the PIP does not take place of VIP. It's an additional IP address. So you still have the same requirements. You still need to make a virtual machine in a cloud service. So you'll already have the VIP and you'll already have the DIP. But PIP will be an additional IP address that's associated. So now you'll have 3 IP addresses that are associated with the virtual machine. Each subscription can have up to 5 PIPs, and if for some reason you need more, you have to call Microsoft. And using PIP allows external traffic to hit virtual machine on any port. So this is very important for both production and exam point of view. You have to remember that a virtual IP address, which was the VIP, is a cloud IP, and the way you are getting into that virtual machine was by specifying a specific port in the endpoint. So when you created the virtual machine, those 2 endpoints were created for you. One was for RDP, one was for PowerShell. So if your virtual machine was going to be a web server, you'd add port 80 or for HTTP or port 443 for HTTPS or whatever. You have to add that endpoint to the virtual machine for the cloud service to get in there. With a PIP, you don't need that. You have all the ports open, so directly somebody can just connect or go to your virtual machine without providing the port or even creating the endpoint, because your virtual machine will just allow PIP to hit the virtual machine directly. And this can be important, and I'll demonstrate that later, because you might have noticed by now that VIP does everything for you. You can go HTTP with the VIP as long as you have endpoint. It's fine. But I'll show you a place where it's not actually fine. When you go to a virtual machine, you know that when you go to the network or on the internet, other computers or services or whatever will see the public IP address. So that's basic networking. Nobody sees your internal IP address. Everybody sees the public IP address. So far, all the virtual machines that we have created actually go out with the cloud's IP address, right? So if we were, let's go back to our diagram here. If we were here, the way this is set up right now, this virtual machine will go out to this user, and this user will see the VIP address. So it will think that this is the address this server came from or whatever. But with a PIP, what will happen is that as soon as you assign a PIP to the virtual machine, it's no longer the VIP. Even though the VIP is there, the virtual machine will know that I have a PIP address, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to show this address to the user. So I'm going to show you how that works as well. So let's go ahead and get into hands-on demo over here so I can explain these concepts to you from there. So I have these 2 virtual machines created from our previous DIP information, part when we were talking about that. So let's show you something here. If you go RDP to the server, there's a couple of things I want to do here to make things easier for us. I do want to turn off the enhanced IE security configuration. I would not do this in production because I do not browse internet a lot from my servers, but I'm just going to do this to make things a little bit easier here. So Internet Explorer does not keep nagging. Let's fire up the Internet Explorer. Okay, ask me later. I'm going to go to this web page called http whatsmyip.net. So this is a website which will show you the IP address people on the internet see you when you come from this server or computer. So you can see you are now going out as 23.101.148.25. What is this IP address? This is actually the VIP. So if you minimize this, let's go in there. You'll see that we are going out from 23.101.148.25. This is exactly what people are seeing you as when you go to the internet, and this website is created in such a way it picks that and it displays that for you. So that's the public IP address you're going out with. And this is the VIP. When we create a PIP address, you'll have to remember that it will no longer pick the VIP or the virtual IP. It will actually take the instance level public IP and show that to the outside users, which is important. The next thing I want to show there is, and I'll demonstrate this part once again when we do the pip part. So the next thing I'm going to show over here is, and this is very interesting, and I found this in totally accidentally, was if you go to my client computer here, this is my regular client computer on premise, right? Let's see. Let's clear the screen here. If I do ping www.microsoft.com, I'm actually getting a ping reply from the web server, www.microsoft.com website. This is actually replying back with this. Okay, now watch this. If I go to the virtual machine on Azure and I do a ping www.microsoft.com and hit enter, it resolves, but I do not get a ping reply. Why do not I get a ping reply? I've thought about this and then I was like, well, the ping is going out, but the echo reply is not coming back in. So maybe the ICMP traffic is not allowed through that. And maybe we need endpoints or something like that. Turns out, no. Microsoft by default will not allow you to send and receive ICMP traffic on your virtual machine when you are using a VIP address to go out. The only time this is going to work is if you actually have an instance level public IP address or a PIP assigned to your server. Is that an important thing for you? 90% of the time, no, because I do not care if my server is not getting and receiving ICMP packets from the internet. It's okay. But we were working on a project where we were using a piece of application or piece of software that was using public ping or ICMP to monitor external servers. And we were totally dumbfounded that, okay, why is this not working? And we found out because of this phenomenon over here, it does not work. So the way to solve that was to assign a pip. And of course, if the pip address is allowed to go out and do that and receive things directly. So you don't need to bother trying to get ICMP ports and put it on endpoints to let the VIP go and do all that stuff because it doesn't work. We have tried. Maybe Microsoft will change this behavior in an update in the future, but so far it has not. Microsoft has not. So how do you go ahead and assign a PIP? Well, same as previously. We'll first get the virtual machine, and I want to press enter over here. Now I want to show you that this is the internal IP address we created, 192.168.100. Look at the public IP address over here. This has always been empty in my previous sessions when we showed this. The reason was because a public IP address is not assigned to this virtual machine. The VIP is actually a cloud IP address for the cloud service. So obviously this was empty. But a PIP, and this is what the PIP is, a PIP is an IP address, a public IP address assigned directly to the virtual machine. So let's go ahead and do that. So we get the virtual machine and we pipe this to set Azure oops, set Azure public IP. And then you have to give a public IP name, because we like just like dip or the internal I mean like just like VIP, we do not pick our public IP. This is given by Azure. So all we have to do here is give a name. So we'll just call this local public local VM public IP, so pub IP or something like that. And of course we are also going to do update Azure VM. The reason we need to do this update Azure VM is because it has to restart, or it has to refresh the virtual machine configuration to apply this configuration. So any configuration that happens to a virtual machine from outside will be applied during restart. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll hit enter. Okay, the task took about, I don't know, 15 seconds to complete. So it has succeeded. And this was the previous output, and you can see the public IP address was not there. So we're going to run the same command. And this time we are going to see a public IP address has been assigned to this virtual machine, and it's called local VM pub IP, the one we had provided here. And Azure went and randomly picked a public IP address for you. So this IP address is not the VIP. It's significantly different. Unfortunately, there's no way to see that directly from here. So that just remains over there. So what we can do is let's go to the virtual machine here. And previously when we went, we saw the VIP address was over here, 23.101.148.25. Just want to show you that the VIP address is still here, 23.101.148.25. However, now that you go outside, let's refresh this web page. And you can see it changed to 23.166.61. which is 23.166.61. As you can see, it went out now publicly with a different IP address, which is the PIP. So anytime you have a PIP assigned to a virtual machine, that's how it's going to go out. And of course, as promised, I wanted to demonstrate one last thing to you, which was now if you come to the server and do a ping www.microsoft.com, you can see that it's getting replies back to the virtual machine, so it's able to ping outside. We have not created any endpoints for this virtual machine. So if you go over here to endpoints, as you can see, I have not done anything else except the remote desktop and the ports over here. Now, the last thing I want to talk about with the VIP and the PIP distinction over here is that how do you connect to this virtual machine now? If you go and connect this with this connect button over here, it will download the RDP file for you, right? So let's go ahead and save that. So I'm going to save this on my desktop, CRanger VM 200. And I'm not going to connect. And before connecting, I want to show you something here. Let's go ahead and edit that. You can see that it's still connecting with CRanger VM 200.cloudapp.net with a port number. So it's still using the VIP address. How do you check that it's using the VIP address to connect? Well, simple, right? Go ping CRanger VM 200.cloudapp.net, and you can directly see that it's using the 23.101.148.25, which was the VIP of the server, right? Over here. And it's using the endpoint that was created for us, which is port 62017, that translates to 3389. So you have to connect to this with 62017 port with the VIP to go out. Okay, but we know that we created an IP address and assigned it directly to the virtual machine. So what if we go here, take that IP address, because Azure does not provide a DNS name for you with this IP address. And what if I do this? Will this connect? Well, absolutely. Because now you have a public IP address directly assigned to the virtual machine, and it will just allow you through. You do not even have to assign the port number. And this is what I was talking about in the slides, that this IP address will allow any port to be connected directly to this virtual machine. And by default, RDP uses port 3389. So 3389 is allowed, so it's allowing you through. And for the DNS, well, you can have any DNS. You can just call this myvm dot, for example, cloudranger.net. So you go to your cloudranger.net or your domain's DNS and have this as an A record, because you know that this is static and it will stay on this virtual machine only. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this session. And so far, this is the stuff we talked about. To add a pip, the commandlet is set as your public IP. And I have not gone through this commandlet, but what we are doing is removing the pip from the VM. The commandlet is remove as your public IP. And it will go and directly find which was the public IP assigned to the VM directly, and will take that away. Okay, so that concludes this session. Unfortunately, this was a little bit more than an hour, and I know these days it's very hard to keep concentration, so you can pause video and digest as much as possible. And the reason this was an important topic, both for exam point of view as well as real life networking. And there are a lot of implications and planning that goes into doing all this thing. So it took a little bit more time to go through this session. Took definitely more than an hour. I try to keep it less than an hour so you can digest more information, but unfortunately that's what it is. And like I mentioned always, that this is not a regular training for you. I'm trying to do this hands-on because obviously we cannot be in a lab together just because how things are. But it gives you an opportunity to have your own subscription and go and do exactly what I'm doing and have a success doing what you're trying to do. If you just follow the way I'm doing, create your virtual machines, get into your subscription, do your thing, you will be able to master this and hopefully take this skill and use it in your lab or in your production. Okay, so as usual, in conclusion, our training site is at www.cloudranger.net/Azure-training. My YouTube channel for this is Cloud Ranger Network. Twitter handle is at Cloud Ranger Blog. Please follow. We have Google Plus, and my email address is sean@cloudranger.net. If you want to reach me personally for something, any questions or anything, you can do so. I know a lot of you have already done this, but please, do not ask me questions personally that could benefit others. If there's no personal information in there that you do not want to provide, use the YouTube's commenting or use the blog sites commenting. So when I answer you, other people who might have this question get answered too. And it's almost now that the channel is getting a little bit busier, there are more views obviously, and more people are watching these videos. I've already received like about 12 to 13 emails on just one video asking some question, and I did clarify, and some of them had same question, and I was like, I wish they just commented on YouTube video and I would have answered there and would be fine. So please do that. And thank you for viewing, and I'll be seeing you in the next session of Azure Virtual Networks. Thank you.